So great question, right? This is where everyone starts. And I'll just say that I strongly believe that if everybody mastered Airbnb data when they're first getting started, they would avoid the mistake of buying a bad property. So if the property is $500,000, it needs to make $100,000 a year to meet the 20% rule, right? The revenue should be 20% of the purchase price. And if you can find homes in today's market that meet that, there's a really good chance that they're going to cash flow for you, right? And so by first looking to see how much a property would make in a certain area and then trying to see if those homes are for sale within that 20% range, that's where you're going to be able to know if there's potential in that market for there to be cash flow in the market.
Hi everybody, Jose Luis Morales here. Welcome back to another episode of the Morales Group Show. Today we have John Bianchi. He is the head of data for TechVestor, the largest Airbnb fund in the country, and also owns a consulting company called Point Analytic. Today's topic is how to find the best Airbnb properties and marketplaces, how to analyze different Airbnb properties, how to select the right market for Airbnb property. So off camera, John mentioned to me that the whole purpose of his job and role is to help people never buy an unprofitable Airbnb ever again. So if you're looking to analyze the right market, analyze the right property, he's going to be teaching us how to do that, going over different tools, data, and trends as to how to find the best Airbnb properties. Welcome to the show, John. How are you?
Good. Thanks for having me on, man. I appreciate it. Really looking
Um,
forward to it.
I'm very excited about this interview because I think this interview has the capabilities of helping a lot of people, especially in the Airbnb space.
Yeah, that's why I love doing them because there's, to me, the data is everything, right? It allows you to be able to ensure you don't make a mistake. But the issue is that it's really complicated. And if you don't have a process for navigating the data, it's easy to make a mistake. And I've just talked to too many people that have bought in properties that lose them money month over month rather than make them money month over month. And so that kind of gives me the energy to keep doing these podcasts and put videos out there and content out there to make sure that people don't make that mistake. So
I
that's
love
what I
it.
do.
So for our viewers, John, who don't know who you are, is who is John Bianchi, and then how did you get involved in the data analyzing space specifically for Airbnbs?
Yeah, sure. So you did give a little bit of an intro, but I'll just kind of give a quick rundown. So I am head of data for TechVestor, TechVestor being one of the largest short-term rental investment funds in America. We haven't found anyone larger than us. That's why we always say one of, right? And I am at the same time, I also have an Airbnb data consulting business called Point Analytics. We've got 3 free, courses online that teach people everything about Airbnb data. So you can do it for free. We have some products and services as well that we can help you do it a little bit more effectively. And so, I live and breathe Airbnb data. It's literally all I do all day, every day, and I absolutely love doing that. The way that I got into it was actually by making quite a bit of mistakes, believe it or not. So the I started my own Airbnb business, which was rental arbitrage and management, and I built it up in Chicago and Scottsdale. And when COVID came around, it kind of wiped out the entire business. I was able to sell off the assets, such as the contracts and leases and things along those lines. But in the process of actually being able to build up that business, I had to analyze the data to be able to find what was going to be the best, most profitable property for us. And the reason I got so crazy with it is because one, I had other people's monies that I was using, right? So I was using investors' money to be able to go out and buy these properties. So I had to make sure that they were going to be profitable. And then two, every once in a while, I would miss something and screw up, right? So I would get a property that would not cash flow or not cash flow as well as another one, right? And then it would make me realize that I'm like, if I had just done better due diligence, I would have been able to find a better property or avoid this mistake, right? And lose that money. A great example of this, like my favorite one, is I actually had 2 properties down in Scottsdale that both did not have pool heaters, and it made it impossible for me to actually be able to compete with anybody in Scottsdale because everybody had pool heaters. And so those properties lost money, right? Like I lost about like 40, $50,000 across those 2 homes during a full year period where I should have made that amount of money, right? And so it was a very, very small mistake that I made that really screwed me over. Um, and by making that mistake, I learned better ways and better processes and better efficiencies to ensure that I don't make that mistake again, right? Now, I know I'm kind of going on a long rant here, but the with that being said, after learning all of that, I have now helped TechVestor buy over 100 properties without a single one of them being a loser, right? Without a single one of them not cash flowing, right? So the process and the mistakes that I made in the past have led me to get to the point where I am now to be ensure that all the properties are profitable moving forward. So which is awesome, right? You know what I mean? You got to learn from your mistakes, and I feel like I have the proof behind me now to be able to say that I have learned from my mistakes.
I love it, John. I think that's awesome, and I think that obviously that track record stands for itself now. Where all of the ones that you guys have bought, you've learned from mistakes. So, what I wanted to ask you is, let's say that I wanted to buy an Airbnb. What's the best? What's the first thing I got to do? Select the right market, and if I'm selecting the right market, how do I go about analyzing the right market?
So great question, right? This is where everyone starts. And I'll just say that I strongly believe that if everybody mastered Airbnb data when they're first getting started, they would avoid the mistake of buying a bad property. And so, I can give you I'm going to give you an answer, right? But the reality is that there's a lot of free content on YouTube that exists that you could go through to actually be able to understand how to do this yourself. So like if I was actually giving somebody advice, it'd be like, go to YouTube, watch the courses, right? You know what I mean? Like that's sort of like a step one because you're going to learn everything. However, the reality is you got to figure out what market that best suits you. Okay. And I always say suits you because the reality is that there's a lot of other markets. There's a lot of money to be made in a lot of different markets across America. Best way to explain it is think of hotels. They're absolutely everywhere. If there's hotels absolutely everywhere, that means that there's money being made in all these markets for short-term travel. Therefore, you should be able to make money on Airbnb as well in a lot of these different markets. And everyone's always looking for like a golden market, right? There's not necessarily one golden market. There's a lot of markets that are losers that will not work, that will not cash flow for you because the real estate's too expensive and there's not enough rental demand. However, the uh, sorry, there are markets where there is money to be made, and they're all roughly the same amount across the board from one location to another, right? The amount of profit that you can make from these different locations. So you know, you got to figure out a market that's going to be best for you. If you're doing rental arbitrage, you're going to have to be in a city because you need there to be a lot of properties that are for rent that you can actually go out there and rent. If you're looking to purchase, that's where you can open up and you can be in a city, you can be in the vacation rental market. But there's data providers out there, such as my company, AirDNA, things like this, and you can use these companies to be able to try to figure out if properties in that area will cash flow. Right? That's kind of step one. It's like, is there potential here? And we use something called the 20% rule when you're buying a property that you can use to be able to vet a market very quickly. Okay, so let's say that you're going to look into Blue Ridge, Georgia, right? And you're considering to buy a property in Blue Ridge, Georgia. And what you could do is you could take a look using one of the data providers to kind of figure out how much revenue is being made from these properties. And you realize, the revenue is around $100,000 for a 3-bedroom. Let's say that you realize that there's like 4 or 5 properties. They're all roughly around making around 100,000, and you have an idea of what the property looks like. It's a cabin. It's good looking. It's got maybe some views to it, whatever it may be. Then what you need to do is go over to Zillow, where the properties are for sale, and see if the properties that are for sale meet the 20% rule. Now, the 20% rule is the price to rent ratio. Do the are the 20 so if the property is $500,000, it needs to make $100,000 a year to meet the 20% rule, right? The revenue should be 20% of the purchase price. And if you can find homes in today's market that meet that, there's a really good chance that they're going to cash flow for you, right? And so by first looking to see how much a property would make in a certain area and then trying to see if those homes are for sale within that 20% range, that's where you're going to be able to know if there's potential in that market for there to be cash flowing properties, right? And then you can sort of add it to your list of places that you may consider entering into. Okay, so I always refer to it as like creating a short list because there's thousands of markets across America, and if you're analyzing all of them, you've got to be able to narrow that list down to a handful and then eventually pick one. And so if you follow that process using the 20% rule, you'll find these locations and then you'll narrow it down. And then once you've narrowed it down, you'll pick one. And once you've picked one, you can deep dive it, right? Or maybe you deep dive like 3 or 4 markets before you officially choose one. And that's a whole other scenario, right? So I'm just talking about the 20% rule helps you on the high level.
I love it. I love it. Now, can it change? Like, meaning, is there a way to make it so that you can see if that market, instead of uptrending, is downtrending? And can new competition affect that market? And what do you look at from that perspective to make sure that uh, that it reduces the chances of that happening?
Okay, good question. The reality is when it comes to short-term rentals, it's different than long-term rentals. Obviously, that's an obvious statement, but in the sense of predicting future revenue, right? So when it comes to long-term rentals, the rent never goes backwards. It's always going steady up, right? So if everyone's making if the rent's $2,000 today, it's going to be $2,000 tomorrow. Maybe it'll go to 2,100, right? In time, and like, but it's never really going from like 2,000 to 4,000 to 1,000 to 3,000. Like it just kind of stays nice and steady. So when it comes to short-term rentals, you have to understand that it's going to fluctuate. There's going to be up years, there's going to be down years, and it is what it is. You just got to be able to make sure you're okay with the downs so you can celebrate those wins, right? When there are those good years. Every market's going to go up and down, right? So what you're asking is kind of twofold here. You're asking about saturation, and then you're also asking about how can I pick a market that may be able to avoid saturation, right? If I'm understanding correctly. Would you agree
100%.
with that? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So I'll start off with how to be able to determine if a market is saturated, and then the next question I think will become a little bit more obvious. So when it comes to saturation, it's really just the number of rentals versus the amount of demand in that area. So how do you figure that out, right? On AirDNA, you're able to see what the revenue growth has been year over year, right? So you're able to see how many active rentals there were in 2019 compared to 2020, 2021, and so on and so forth. And you can see that there'll be a steady uptrend. And they show it in a quarterly way. At least they used to. I haven't fully played around with all the new changes that they've made, which was like 3 days ago. And so they might show it a little bit differently, but they do have the ability to show you the revenue, or sorry, the rental growth. So how many new listings are coming onto the market quarter over quarter. And this is useful, right? Because if you look at, Q1 of 2022 compared to Q1 of 2023, you can see how many new rentals you have in that market. And you could see what percentage it increased by. So you can see hypothetically that there's 10% more rentals in that market. And if that's the case, what you want to make sure is that the revenue also increased by 10%, right? Because you have 10% new listings, there should be 10% revenue growth to be able to fill those Airbnbs, right? There's more revenue that's coming to that market. And so there's a location on AirDNA as well that you can check to see how much the revenue has increased during that exact same time period, right? So Q1 2022 compared to Q1 of 2023. How much did the revenue increase year over year? What is the percentage? Okay. And you always want the revenue to be outpacing the supply. You always want that. So you want to see that if the supply went up by 10%, that the revenue at a minimum went up by 10%. Okay. If it went up by more than 10%, that means that there's a lot of demand in that market and it's not being met. Right. However, with that being said, if the revenue, say, was negative 5% in comparison to the supply, that's okay. That's not the end of the world. What you don't want to see is like a consistent negative 5%, negative 10%, negative 20%, right? Like quarter over quarter over quarter, you've got the revenue not being able to keep up with the supply, because what that means is that there's homes sitting empty. They're not making as much money because there's too many homes to fill for the amount of people that are traveling to that market, right? So in other words, what I'm trying to say is that's, obviously that's saturation. There's too many homes, right? The way to look into it is go to AirDNA, look at the revenue growth, look at the supply growth, and make sure that the revenue is outpacing the supply, right? That's how you know that you'll be okay. So that's kind of the first part there. And then the second question you asked is like, how do I ensure that I can get into a market that's not going to get oversaturated? That's a really difficult question to answer because there's no straightforward response to it, right? Like the reality is that if a market is hot and people are making money in it, and more people are going to go to that market, it's going to happen, right? The way I see it is the only way that I think of that can limit saturation is if there's regulations that limit the number of Airbnbs within that market. But I'm against that. Like I'm fully against that. I think that there should be people who I think that you don't know the true number of listings that are needed in that market until people stop making money, right? And that's going to suck for some people, but it is what it is, right? So my response to that is, instead of trying to bulletproof yourself by getting into a market that's never going to get saturated, instead build a listing that can withstand saturation. Okay, because what is saturation again, right? Saturation is when you have less people traveling to an area in comparison to the amount of homes that can actually host them. So there's too many homes. But the reality is that there's still people traveling there. And so what you need is you still need to be you need to be one of those homes that still gets booked, right? And if you can build a listing that is better than 75% of your competition out there, it's likely that you'll still continue to get booked, right? Where people will argue with that is saying that, well, if a 50% of the market's not getting booked, they're going to lower their prices so a crazy amount, and then I have to lower my prices to be able to compete with that. And the reality is, like, yeah, that's true. That's probably going to happen. You're going to have to lower your prices to be able to compete with the people who are not getting bookings, right? With that being said, you could still get booked during that time frame, right? Like you still want to be the person who gets booked even with the lower rate in comparison to the other home that's lowering the rate and not getting booked, right? Like that's a big deal. And if you can weather the storm, if you can like work through this time period where there is oversaturation, these people who are not getting booked will eventually stop because they won't be making money, and they'll have to get rid of their listing. They'll have to turn it back into a rental or a home or whatever it may be. Then there's going to become less listings in the market. And then you survive that. And then once there's less listings, everyone starts pricing it properly again. And you're going back to the numbers that you wanted to be able to get during that time frame. That's going to happen in almost every single market. That is a in-demand market across the next decade. So if you're planning on having an Airbnb for the next decade, prepare for when that time comes, right? Like it's going to happen inevitably. Does that make sense?
It does. So basically, just make the best listing possible, which we'll get into details as to what you're seeing to make the best listing possible. What I wanted to ask before we get into that is you mentioned obviously the 20% rule. We talked a little bit about saturation and how to track saturation. What other metrics are you looking at on AirDNA or even your own tools to determine whether or not it's a good market?
It's really like honestly. So I've gone through over 300 markets, and I've got 3 checkpoints. And if they don't match those 3 checkpoints, I move on. Right. First one's regulation. If the market has no regulation, we're not really a fan of that. And the reason being is because they can add regulation whenever they want and screw us over. The other one is they're overly regulated and we can't get into the market. So that's another one that we avoid as well. So we're looking for some place that has regulation that allows Airbnbs in some sort of way, and we play within their rules, right? So that's kind of step one. I know it's not really that doesn't sound like a data point, but it is a data point, right? The next one is the 20% rule. Like, do the properties meet the 20% rule, which I've already mentioned before? If they don't, I move on, right? Because I know just based off of that we're not going to be able to cash flow. We need a cash flow, therefore I can't look into it. And then the third one is comes down to the saturation, right? If it meets the regulation, it meets the 20% rule. I want to check the saturation quickly. Is it the saturated market? No. Okay, sounds good. We'll move forward. With that being said, I've only found one market that was so saturated that I avoided it. That was it, which was Atlantic City. All of the other ones were not oversaturated or were slightly saturated, but they were not. It was never to the point where I'm like, there's no way I'm entering this market. It's so saturated. Other than Atlantic City. So, not to say that a market won't get oversaturated, right? It takes time and it builds up, and you have to have thousands of people who commit to opening up an Airbnb in an area and take that financial risk for it eventually become saturated. But those are the 3 metrics. If the market passes all 3 of those tests, that's when I'm like, okay, let's deep dive this market because I feel confident about it.
Got it. So you mentioned to me a little bit about TechVestors, and I don't know what liberty you're allowed to talk about. Do you mind me asking just some of the markets that you guys are currently invested in and why?
Unfortunately, I cannot. So
Okay.
that is one of those ones where I can't go around just sharing too much. However, we do give away some information on our website. So like if you go to that, it's not overly difficult to find, but I'm not going to sit here and share it. So,
Which is
but
good.
but yeah, unfortunately, I can't on that one.
I
Yeah.
thought I'd give it a try, you know.
Yeah. You're not the first one. There's been quite a few people have asked, and I'm like, I'm sorry.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah.
So I like the fact that you're like, if it's no regulation, it actually could be a bad thing because maybe they haven't had too much experience with Airbnb, but at some point they can come up with something. But if they have some regulation, at least you somewhat know where they stand, basically.
Exactly. Yeah.
I love it.
That's
I
super
love it.
helpful.
Good. Okay, so let's get into something that you mentioned about building a great listing. Like, in your opinion, what makes a great listing relative to other properties in the market, and what makes a listing that is able to withstand competition or other competitors coming in the market?
It's honestly, it's very simple. I don't want to overcomplicate it. Make a listing that's better than everybody else that you're around. If I could just leave it at that, right? If you just thought about that for a second, make a listing that's better than everybody else. Well, what makes it better? You add more value. How do you add more value? You have more amenities. You have more design. You have more features. Like you have, it's like any other business that exists in the world. The business that provides the most value is the one that's going to win every single time, right? Um, so the reality is that if you want to withstand your competition, you have to have a home that people want over everybody else in that market. Everyone has bedrooms, everyone has a kitchen, everyone has a dining room, most people have a backyard, right? So it's like, okay, what can you do that's above that? And so really it comes like there's also a budget limit here, right? So a lot of the times there's people have constraints to their budget and they can't just spend anything to make it an amazing listing, right? But you still can design it better than other people. Like design doesn't take a crazy amount of money. So like if you're on a budget, design and photos are one and two that help drive revenue and help you get eyeballs on your property, right? Because the thing is you want people to uh, see your listing, be intrigued with it, and click into it. Whether they book it or not, you want more eyeballs on your property. So by having like eye-catching photos through good design and good photos, you're going to get more eyes on your property. That's kind of a step one, right? The step two is the amenities. So does everybody in your market have a hot tub? If they do, you need one. Does everybody have a putting green? If you do, they need one, right? That's what I refer to as like a must-have amenity. So to be competitive within that market, you must have it. As an example, I said earlier, I didn't have a pool heater in Scottsdale, and that screwed me over, right? I wasn't able to get as much revenue as I thought I was because people weren't willing to book a home that didn't have a pool heater. So it's because they had so many other options of people that did have it. So why would they ever book mine for almost the same price or maybe even a little more, right? Made no sense. So you got to figure out what are those must-have amenities within your market, and honestly, a pool heater could be one of them. And then once you've been able to add those things in, right? So first you got good design, then you got good photos, then you're starting to look at your must-have amenities, and then once you finish up with all of that, it's when you get into the competitive advantage, right? So that's where you start bringing in amenities that nobody else has. That turns your place into even more desirable location. Okay. And then to kind of put fuel on the fire on this is to figure out what is the absolute best demographic for that market and then design and build everything for that clientele, right? So if a bachelorette group, if you're seeing in the data that bachelorettes are constantly like paying the most for listings, so like say you come across a listing, it's all pink, it's beautiful, and it's making more than everybody else. Well, that's telling you that bachelorettes are willing to pay more than everybody else for that market, right? So then you can build an entire listing that's designed around a bachelorette party and give them something that's very unique. It's going to create a great experience for them through design, through photos, through the must have amenities, right? It's the same logic that applies. And you've now have something that is better than the vast majority of your competition because the bachelorettes are willing to pay more. And the data shows that by the listings that are making the most are bachelorette themed. And then you can take that and you can apply that to any single demographic across whatever market that you're in, whether it be families or bachelor parties or, wedding gatherings, like whatever it is, right? And one thing I'll say on that, and when I say families, people don't realize that it's like, oh, we made this nice like family gathering place. Like we have a nice spot that's focused on families. That's great. Focus it on the kids. The parents are going to pay whatever they have to give their kids a great experience because they're going to have a good time regardless, right? It doesn't really matter what the place looks like. They're doing it for the kids. And so put all the money into the kids, not the family, if that makes sense.
I love it. I
Yeah.
love it. That sounds good. Um, Good. What are you seeing any trends yourself? I know that bachelorettes are a trend. Are you seeing any trends as it relates to tiny homes? Are you seeing any trends to destinations where maybe there's nature? Are you seeing any trends for Like what kind of trends are you seeing in the Airbnb?
So when COVID hit, the unique remote listings started doing really well, right? And we're talking about like the remote cabins that were actual buildings that were put together really well, or some people building yurts and domes and all these different things. That still today is still a thing that people enjoy to do because it gets them out in nature. It's super unique. It's a nice couple getaway, stuff like that, right? Um, it's not as big of a trend as it was before, but it still exists. And the people who are succeeding with that are the ones that again are providing a really great value in that type of an experience. And it's getting bigger and bigger. So like instead of just having a dome in the middle of a forest and putting a deck around it, what people are doing now is they're building communities, right? They've been doing it for a long time, but now they're building like 10 domes, and you have 10 domes in this community. Everybody gets their own, but then they have like a community pool and a community hot tub and sauna and all these different things so that they can provide those amenities at scale to all these different people. And then they still make it like a beautiful experience and a really great spot and beautiful photos, and it pulls everybody in, right? um as for like other trends, it's design is getting more and more and more ramped up. I noticed that. So like even Airbnb design companies are coming, they're showing up a lot more now, right? So like Summerlin Designed is a company that exists out there that does an amazing job, and they go all out. So now people are spending like $40,000 on furniture just to make their place stand out over everybody, right? And it's working because people want that really cool experience, right? It's super unique in the way that it's set up, but people want it. So I would say design is probably the biggest trend, like improving design as time goes on.
Got it. Awesome. What tools, besides AirDNA, besides your website, would you say are crucial in analyzing Airbnb data and trends?
Um, if I'm being honest, I don't think any of them are. So, if like if you're saying crucial, if you have AirDNA or my tool, like you can get the answers you're looking for. Um, I'll give like a shout out to Rabu. They give out a free option that does give you some information. RABBU. They definitely provide some tool that can be useful to get a high level of a market. Um, Trying to think of another tool out there that, but I mean, really with just those three, like you have all the information you need to be able to make the decision you have to make, right? Anyways, so
Yeah,
and I
that
mean,
answer. So
yeah,
I
like
guess I guess I would say, what's the secret to like? Because obviously you've learned a lot from analyzing different data, and I'm sure that if I jumped into AirDNA, I probably wouldn't know what to look for as much as you do. So what would what is the key to analyzing the data? Like, is it
it's practice, it's time. That's all it is. The reality is that it's a skill. It's not something that you can just like look at and be like, oh, I got this. Here's the answer, right? You can't just look at AirDNA and know the answer. That's
yeah
that's the thing. You can't just look at tons of rows of data and know the answer. You have to be able to understand what you're looking at. You have to be able to understand what to avoid in the data, right? There's tons of bad data out there. You have to be able to like reasonably be able to logically explain how much a property is going to make based off of all the other comps out there, and know that you're not lying to yourself to just try to amplify the property that you want because it's pretty, right? Like, and it takes time. You have to go through it over and over again. There's a lot of little nuances to it, and if you just take the time to make sense of things as you're going through and kind of learn this new skill of analyzing data, you'll eventually get to the point of being able to find the answers and find the secrets and find the inefficiencies within every single market. And one thing I want to point out for anyone who's listening to this and just heard me say that you have to develop the skill of analyzing data, there you're probably like, I'm not good at math. I don't know how to do this, right? Like I'm not going to be able to do it. The reality is it's not, you're not learning formulas. You're not learning anything math related. All you are doing is you're looking at a listing and saying, why is this listing making more than the one below it? What is it about it? Does it have a hot tub? Does it not have a hot tub? There's no math behind that. There's no science behind that. It's you're reviewing it and you're making notes on the properties, you're making sense of it. And when you do that, you start to understand why one property would make $100,000 and the other one would make $75,000, but yet they're neighbors, right? You have properties side by side and on the same street, same size. Like I've shown off a listing on one of my TikToks that showed it was the same sized home managed by the exact same person, literally on the same street in Dallas, and the one was making it was either $10,000 or $15,000 more.
A year.
And the thing is that's the most beautiful data to me because it's an exact replica, but one's making more. And it was so obvious why the other one was making more. It was because it had a slightly better design, but the photos were significantly better. And so it's making so like that's all you need to know to be like, oh, it's only making that much more because of this one thing, right? So what I'm trying to say by explaining all of that is just saying that there is no secret. It's a skill you have to develop to be able to get into this industry to ensure that you don't buy an unprofitable property.
Got it. So
And then you
basically,
have
just looking at the
sorry.
different listings and looking at why some of them are performing better than others, and then coming up with conclusions as to why that is performing better than others, basically.
Exactly. Yeah.
Got it.
There's a little bit more to it, but for the most part, that's it. Yeah.
What are don't do's when looking at data?
What are don't do's?
Yeah, like things to avoid, or not things to avoid, like uh, are busy streets okay for Airbnbs? Like things that you're like, I would stay away from this.
Hmm. That's a really good question. I haven't had that question, but because
Good.
all right, so
And,
let me
and
think
if
about
maybe you can't come up with that, maybe we come up with like, okay, what are some of the mistakes that you made? Like, so one of them that was really helpful to me was the heater in the pool. That was helpful. What are
yeah.
other mistakes that you have seen for other people? You just mentioned the design. One of them, the photos versus the other one. Um, what are other things in that same
Yep, I can help with
arena?
that. So I can talk about my mistakes. That's easy. I can
Let's
go
do
through all
it. I
those.
love it. Yeah,
Yeah.
I think we can
The
learn a lot from that.
yeah, agreed. So I would say the um, first mistake that comes to mind is common space. Okay, so if you have a large listing that's going to be hosting 8 to 16 people, regardless of which end you're on that spectrum, you got to be thinking about the amount of space that they're going to have to be able to communally hang out together, right? So I had a property that had a very small dining space. Like the dining table, it was really, really small, and even the living room space was small. It looked beautiful at these high ceilings, but everything was really tight and small. And it was a 4 bedroom that slept 12 people. And it was my smallest 4 bedroom that I had in Chicago, where I had all these other ones that were significantly larger. Like I had one directly across the street that was probably twice the size of this one, right? And in my head, when I was originally looking at this, because I was learning the skill when I was reviewing these two, I'm like, well, they're both 4 bedrooms, they're both located in the same area, therefore they should both roughly make the same amount of money, right? But the reality is that the other one was a lot bigger. It had like a second living room that we had a pool table in. It had more amenities, more features, more design. It had better views. Like it had a better look from the outside in comparison to this one as well. So it had all of these advantages over the other one. And yet in my head, I was like, well, these are going to make the same because they're both 4 bedrooms in the same area. Looking back at it, I'm like, that's so dumb. You know what I mean? Like, how did I even think that was possible, right? But the reality is that you don't realize that that could be a scenario when you're first getting started if you don't understand the data. So that was one of the mistakes I made. Common space area. So like I used to say that I would never get a property in Chicago in the certain area that I was in unless it had a dining room. And like I would tour properties, and I had this one. It was the best possible spot. It was the most profitable spot in all of Chicago. And this guy was like, "Hey, you can have it for $4,000 a month." And I knew I had another property down the street that made 120,000, $40,000 of profit. I was like, this would be amazing. But the reality is that it did not have a dining table, and it had barely any common space, and so I had to turn it down, right? Which is heartbreaking, but it would have lost me money in all reality. So common space is a big one that I've seen. The other one is overpaying. So whether you're renting or if you're buying, it's just that you're looking at a home, you're like, wow, this is going to do amazing. It's going to make so much money. And not running the numbers properly and overpaying for something. So like the very first one that I got, like the very, very first one. Didn't even know AirDNA existed, all of this stuff, right? And I got it in downtown Detroit. It was a 2 bedroom, 1 bath loft that I was paying like $2,300 a month on. You can get 2 bedrooms in Detroit for like at that time probably like $800. You know what I mean? But I wanted like the cool one, right? The one that was right in the middle of everything. The one that was like the loft that was beautiful. Like I right above, right near the Nike store, stuff like that, right? Like it was such a cool spot. So I'm like, oh, this is gonna do amazing because it's so cool. But the reality is that's not the case at all. You want the unsexy property. You want the one that's what I would refer to as the inefficiency within the market. So that property I got, and it didn't work out, right? Didn't make any money off of it. But the ones in Chicago that I got one that was directly across, or sorry, directly beside train tracks. So like this, the train literally went right past the house. It was on the train was up 2 stories. You'd be standing in the living room. There's a window right there, and you can see the train go right past you. And the rent was $1,000 cheaper than everybody else because of that. Now it didn't matter to the guests because they're only there for 3 days. It's a cool feature. The train passes right by. All I had to do was make sure that everybody knew that existed before they got there, and I'd had no complaints. Right. So the other mistake, I guess, what I'm trying to say is that don't go for the cool thing, right? Go for the inefficiency within the market, which tends to be the thing that has something a little bit negative about it, but that kind of makes it less desirable. But the home itself is still awesome, and guests that are only there for 3 days won't care. So that's two that I can think of off the top of my head of mistakes that I've made.
What about design things that you're saying that are working? We talked a lot about design. We even talked about a company called Summerlin Design. What things are you seeing as it relates to design that are kind of working?
Color and what I refer to as fullness. So the property feels full. It's a lot of the times the furniture is what people will cheap out on, not in like a negative way. They get an Airbnb property. They know they have to have a couch. They know they have to have a dining table and beds. And so they put those things in there and they call it an Airbnb, right? Well, the reality is that if I then go and do those same things, but then add like a theme almost to the home, not like an over the top theme, but like a well designed theme, whether it be like boho or Tulum style or something along those lines, right? I know those two styles I just mentioned don't have any color, but like you could pick one that does have a lot of color, right? And if I design my home with that sort of theme to it, and then I add a lot of like the accents, like wallpaper and fake plants and a lot of these like little knickknacks and stuff like that all over the place, it's going to give it a feeling, right? It's going to give it like a style, just like your shelf behind you has a feeling to it, right? Like that's your personality behind you. And in the home you can create a personality through the design that's going to pull people in, right? So as an example, like I liked to use the color light blue when I had my homes in Chicago because that pulled in large groups of women that wanted to stay there. And so I focused on bachelorette parties and I got them attracted to my listing by having the color light blue across the listing, right? And so you can design your listing in a way that's going to pull the people that you want to stay there, and then that's going to help you get a higher average nightly rate because they see this as a better experience for them because it's more there's a psychological play to it, right? Where they feel attached to it because it's something that speaks to them, let's say.
Got it. What about seasonality? What do you look for in seasonality?
It depends. So seasonality is one of these things that like people are really nervous about or like to avoid. But the reality is that take Destin, Florida, or the entire Panhandle of Florida. Uh, that location really only has like 2 strong months. It's got a couple of shoulder months that where there's some peak season, but a lot of people are closing their doors for 6 months out of the year there, right? However, within that short period of time, they're actually able to make so much money that they still cash flow off that property, right? So for me to say, hey, I'm only going into a market that has 6 peak seasons or 6 peak months, that doesn't make any logical sense because we know that there's other markets that only have two and they perform really well. So when it comes to seasonality, I think it comes into play for two ways. One is cash flow. So when you're trying to get started, you need to have an understanding that if you open up in the dead season, you're not going to make money right off the bat. If you open up in the peak season, you're going to make less money than you would have, but you're going to have cash flow to be able to pay your bills, right? So best time to open is always right before peak season, month or two before it, right? The other way to be thinking about it is when you're thinking about adding another market into your portfolio. So you've got one market that does well, try to find another market with maybe the opposite seasonality or a couple of other months that would be peak months to steady out your cash flow across your portfolio. So
Got
yeah.
it. What
Yep.
about like, are there certain occupancy rates? Like, let's say there isn't a seasonality. Are there certain occupancy rates that you look for? What should an occupancy rate target look like?
I've never looked into it. If I'm being, honestly, never looked into it. And the reason being is because I look at the annual revenue at the end of the day. If a property only has 50% occupancy but makes $100,000 a year and I can buy it for 500,000, that's great. That means I'm going to be spending less on my utilities and my cleanings and all these other things and still walking away with a property that meets the 20% rule, right? A lot of people get scared by that and they're like, "Oh, it's only 50% occupancy." That's not the case. 90% occupancy just means more expenses, right? It doesn't necessarily always mean more revenue because you can lower your nightly rate as much as you want and get 100% occupancy, right? So I just have never found it to be a useful metric to look into.
So obviously, yearly numbers or yearly revenue is an important metric. Saturation is an important metric. We have um, seasonality a little bit just because cash flow wise, depending on when you open. Any other important metrics that we would look at as it relates to analyzing the right markets or analyzing the right properties?
Data wise, nothing's coming to mind, but the other two things are taxes and regulations. So, there's some locations if you're planning on buying a property and doing a cost segregation to be able to offset your taxes, then finding a place where the land value is a lesser percentage of the total home value is going to be more beneficial for you when it comes to that. So, instead of buying in California, you're buying in I don't know the states very well. I think I don't know which state I'm trying to think of. I just know you avoid California when it comes to those. So, but yeah, so that taxes would be one, regulations the other, saturation, annual revenue. Like yeah, I think you mentioned a lot of things. Inventory within the market is obviously another one too. Home value, like average home value within that market, scalability within that market, right? What is the actual market if you were to be looking at it more of like a growth idea? So is this a market where the home values are probably going to come down or are they going to go up, right? So these metrics start to get away from Airbnb specific metrics and more so focus on like traditional real estate, which still is a factor, especially if you're purchasing, right?
Got it. One of the things that you said is, like, let's say there's more amount of listings coming in every month, and then you look also for growth in the market. Like, meaning, like, it tells you the total revenue that the market produces, basically combined of Airbnbs. What would make a market increase in revenue versus decrease in revenue?
So say you got 100 listings in that market, right? But you've got 120 people that travel to that market. And then you then add in another 20 listings. So now you got 120 listings. And those additional 20 people that had to go into a hotel or, couldn't find an Airbnb, they now have the option to get an Airbnb, right? So in other words, there's demand for the Airbnbs, but there's not enough supply to be able to fill it. And so the way the revenue increases is you got new Airbnbs and people willing to stay in those Airbnbs.
And how do you determine if there's demand but not enough listings to fulfill them? Is that based on occupancy or is that based on, like, how do you determine that?
How do you determine if there's enough demand to be able to fill future listings? That's the question, right?
Yeah.
It's a good question. So I think it's a combination of things. One is you're able to see year over year past saturation levels, right? And saturation can be no saturation, right? So let's say that I saw for the past 4 quarters that the revenue was continually outpacing the supply. Well, that would tell me likely that if I were to add a listing into this market, there's going to be people who are willing to stay there because it's continuing that way. So that would be like probably the first thing, rather than going the opposite way, right? So if I saw for the past 4 to 8 quarters, it's constantly going down, then I'm like, okay, well, there's probably too many listings here to begin with. And so that would be one. The other one would just be like the general. Then you want to, like, if you really want to get into that, right? Then you have to start looking at tourism demand for the market, right? And consistency of tourism as well. So a huge trend that everybody hopped onto during COVID was finding these remote cabins kind of in the middle of nowhere because they were doing extremely well when COVID hit, right? And that worked great for about 2020, for 2020, 2021, and even a little bit in 2022. But the reality is that once COVID was over and people could go everywhere they wanted to go, these super remote cabins, people had already been going there for 2 years. They didn't care to go to there again. They want to go back to the cities. They want to go internationally, right? So some people hopped on this trend and just crushed it for like a year, and then it kind of fizzled, right? So if you're thinking about future demand, are you hopping on a fad, or are you in a market that's going to have a never-ending flow of tourism into that market, right? Is there a major city 2 hours away, and there's millions of people in that major city that are constantly going to want to be getting out of that city, right? If that's the case, then you're probably going to have never-ending demand, right? Are you next to a national park that's going to have never-ending demand as well? That's probably a good thing too, right? So like those are kind of the ways to think about future demand.
Got it. I love it. Good. Anything else, John, that you think would be helpful to somebody analyzing markets, analyzing properties, and just trying to figure out where to find the best Airbnb and where to find the best markets?
Sorry about that. So yeah, my last thing that I kind of challenge people, right? So anyone who's listening to this and is like, this is gold, this is great, I'm really happy about it, right? Like, and is like kind of picking up these nuggets. There's a couple things. So the first thing I'll say, again, I've mentioned this before, but I do have free training on YouTube that literally teaches you about the vast majority of what I know, right? And so if you just go through that training, you're going to learn so much. But what I challenge you is to find the inefficiency within your market. What I mean by that is almost every market that I've researched that I saw, it met the 20% rule, it met all these different metrics. I'm like, I want to deep dive this market. I can almost always find some sort of inefficiency within the market that has the best possible cash flow. So an example is the property in Chicago that I was talking about that had the train track that went right past it. That was $1,000 less than every other property around it, but made the exact same amount of money, right? And which means that I saved $12,000 automatically, and which means I made $12,000 automatically, right? Just by picking out something that I refer to as an inefficiency within the market. There's another place that I found that was directly across from a Section 8, but the home was amazing, right? But the rent was lower because of that. But people who were only there for 3 days didn't care because they just think that this is Chicago, right? Like it is what it is. So there's other every like when you're going into a place to like buy a home as well. I can't give away this market, but I'll give an example. Okay, so there's this one market that I know, and this is what I'm going to be looking for, right? Where there's these cabin homes, and then there's these suburban looking homes, and they both exist, sort of coexist side by side within this general. The reality is that the suburban homes are a lot less sexy, right? So they're a lot less desirable because of that reason. However, they're like 1,000 square feet larger almost always, so they're a lot bigger. And there's a lot of large groups that come to this area. So if you have a really large home, people are going to be more pulled to it. And then on top of that, you can find a place that has no pool, but you can add a pool into it. And it wouldn't necessarily be like you don't necessarily need to do a in-ground pool, and you don't want to do like a circle cheap above ground pool, but you can kind of find like a mix and add a deck around it, something like that, right? You get this sort of thing going on. So what ends up happening is you have a non-cabin, and so you're paying less for it because it's not as sexy. So it's already cheaper. But you know that one of the biggest revenue drivers in there is the pool, right? So then you have the ability now to add in a pool for a fraction of the cost of what it would have cost. And so now you have a cheap home, and you're adding in an amenity that drives the revenue like crazy. And that now becomes a very, very dominant listing within that area. And sorry, if you're able to do that and able to find that, you're going to make a lot of money within that market, right? So that's an example that I'm explaining right now of the exact home that I'm looking for when I'm going to go out and purchase one. I'm doing JV deals with people and finding these types of listings, right? So the thing that I challenge people is to find that inefficiency within your market where the home value is cheaper in comparison to the other homes in the area, but the revenue potential is the same, if not more, right? Based off of what drives revenue within that market.
I love it. I
Yeah.
love it. And where could people get in touch with you, John, if they wanted to?
So my recommendation for everybody is to not reach out to me unless you've watched my YouTube stuff. Okay. So I strongly recommend that, because a lot of times people reach out to me and I'm just like, have you seen any of the stuff on YouTube yet? Because it teaches you almost everything. Like, in other words, when people usually reach out, they have a question, and most of the questions are answered on my YouTube channel. So I tell people, like, if you do want to reach out to me, please start with the YouTube. Go to, it's at the airbnbdataguy.com, or sorry, at the Airbnb data guy. That's my handle on TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube. And start there. And if you go through there, you can go to my about page, you can find my email, and then you can reach out to me through email with whatever advanced questions that you may have, or if you want to connect. You can also, DM on Instagram as well. I tend to try and respond to that as much as I can. But yeah, so that's my recommendation for that.
I love it. Well, I want to say thank you, John, for coming on the show. Thank you. I found a lot of value in this. I'm more of a newbie, and I try to not be involved in a lot of the technical stuff as it relates to our Airbnbs, but I'm always curious to know. So I appreciate, obviously, you coming on. For our viewers today, we had John Bianchi. He talked about how to find the best Airbnb properties and markets, how to select the right markets for Airbnb properties, and how to analyze different Airbnb properties. If you've enjoyed this episode, make sure to hit the subscribe button. If you feel that this episode would be helpful to somebody, make sure to hit the share button. Thanks again, John, and to our viewers, until next time.